everyone. I hope you're all having a beautiful day. Today, we'll uncover one of the most emotional moments in Jack and Tu Tien's story. After 2 exhausting days at the hospital, they receive heartbreaking news that Jack has passed away, only to discover moments later that he's still alive. A terrible mistake, a shocking twist, and a reminder of how fragile love and life truly are. If you enjoy stories filled with emotion and heart, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episode. And please let us know where you're watching from and how you feel about this story. Your thoughts mean so much to us. Morning light filtered softly through the hospital corridor, washing the white walls in a calm, fragile glow. After 2 sleepless nights, Tu Tien's eyes burned with fatigue. She had barely eaten, her mind consumed by one thing: Jack. The faint, steady beeps from his room had become the rhythm of her life, the sound she feared most and clung to most tightly. Mrs. Ly, her face pale with exhaustion, placed a hand on Tu Tien's shoulder. "Let's go downstairs for a few minutes," she said gently. "Just to get some fruit for when Jack wakes up. He'll need strength." Tu Tien hesitated, glancing toward the door as though leaving might break the fragile thread keeping him alive. "What if he wakes while we're gone?" "He won't be alone," the older woman replied. "The nurses are right here. You'll collapse if you don't eat something." Reluctantly, Tu Tien nodded. The air outside the room felt different, too open, too real. They walked down the corridor, each step echoing softly, the hospital's morning hum surrounding them. The world outside Jack's room continued as if nothing had changed. Doctors talked quietly, carts rolled by, the scent of disinfectant mixed with the faint aroma of breakfast from the hospital canteen. At the fruit counter, Tu Tien reached for a small bag of apples. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked through them, remembering how Jack once joked that hospital apples always tasted like hope, too crisp, too clean, too artificial to be real. She almost smiled at the thought. "Bananas too," said Mrs. Ly softly. "He likes those." Tu Tien nodded, her throat tightening. If only he could eat them right now. The vendor, an elderly man with kind eyes, glanced at her belly. "Your husband will be fine, dear. God bless him," he said, not knowing how much those words meant. Tu Tien managed a weak smile. "Thank you." They paid for the fruit, packed neatly into a small plastic bag. As they turned to leave, a nurse hurried past them, her shoes squeaking against the floor. She looked distressed, her expression tight. Something in the air shifted. Moments later, just as they stepped back into the corridor, a young doctor ran toward the nurse's station. "Where's Mrs. Ly?" he called out breathlessly. "The family of patient Jack, room 204? Tu Tien froze. Her pulse quickened. "That's us," she said immediately, stepping forward. "I'm his wife." The doctor's face fell into a solemn expression, the kind that carried more weight than any words could. "I'm terribly sorry," he said softly. "Jack's condition worsened suddenly. We did everything we could, but he didn't make it." The world collapsed. Tu Tien felt her knees give way, the bag of fruit slipping from her hands and spilling across the polished floor, apples rolling away, one by one. "No," she gasped. "That's not possible. He was stable. He was getting better." Her voice cracked, echoing down the sterile hallway. Mrs. Ly's face went pale as chalk. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. "No, doctor. My son. He can't be gone." The doctor bowed his head slightly. "Please accept my condolences. We tried everything." Tu Tien shook her head violently, clutching at her chest. "You're lying," she whispered, barely breathing. He promised he'd see our twins." Tears burst forth uncontrollably as she fell into Mrs. Loy's arms. The older woman, though shaking, tried to steady her, but her own sobs broke through. The two women stood there, broken, while nurses looked on in quiet pity. The corridor blurred into a haze of white and grief. People passed, voices echoed, but nothing felt real. Tu Tien's mind reeled. How could she have left for just 10 minutes? How could the world be so cruel as to steal him the moment she turned her back? She couldn't breathe. Her chest felt hollow, her legs weak. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. Only a low, broken cry escaped her lips. Mrs. Loy whispered through tears, "We need to see him." "Yes," Tu Tien said, trembling. "I need to see him." They rushed toward the elevator, their hearts pounding in unison, every second an eternity. When the doors opened, they stumbled out, half running through the hallway toward Jack's room. Each step echoed louder than the last. The door was closed. For a heartbeat, Tu Tien couldn't move. Her hand hovered over the handle, shaking violently. "I can't," she whispered. Mrs. Loy reached for her. "We have to." Tu Tien took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside, Jack was there. Lying exactly as they'd left him, the soft rhythm of the heart monitor still pulsing, steady and alive. Tu Tien froze. For a long, breathless second, she thought she was dreaming. The room was quiet, calm, peaceful. The sunlight spilled through the curtain, touching Jack's hand like a gentle reminder of life. "Jack?" she whispered, her voice cracking. He didn't move, but the steady beeping of the monitor filled the air, proof that he was there, still fighting. Mrs. Loy gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. "He's alive," she whispered, trembling. "Oh my God, he's alive!" Tu Tien stumbled forward, dropping to her knees beside the bed, clutching his hand. "Jack, it's me," she sobbed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You're alive. You're still here." She looked at the monitor, at his chest rising and falling, and let out a shaky laugh through her tears. The relief that washed over her was so intense, it almost hurt. The nurse who had been tending to Jack looked up, startled by their entrance. "What's going on?" she asked, frowning. "The doctor said, he said Jack was gone," Tu Tien cried. "He told us he died." The nurse blinked in confusion. "That's impossible. He's been stable all morning." Tu Tien stared at her, disbelief flooding her mind. "But they said his name. They said Jack in room 204. The nurse turned pale. She quickly stepped out, calling down the hallway. Within moments, another doctor came rushing in, this one older, composed, but clearly alarmed. "What happened here?" he asked, scanning their faces. Tu Tien rose unsteadily. "You told us my husband died," she cried. "But he's right here. He's breathing. His heart is beating." The doctor's eyes widened slightly. He looked at the patient chart, then back at the monitor, then at her. His expression shifted from confusion to realization. "My God," he whispered. "There's been a mistake." Tu Tien blinked, breathless. "A mistake?" The doctor sighed deeply, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Another patient, also named Jack, passed away just now. The message was sent to the wrong family. I'm so sorry. This was a terrible mix-up." For a moment, no one spoke. Then, as the truth sank in, Tu Tien broke down again, but this time in overwhelming relief. She pressed her forehead against Jack's hand, sobbing uncontrollably. "You're alive," she whispered between gasps. "You're alive." Mrs. Loy sank into the nearby chair, tears of joy running down her face. "Thank God. Thank you, God." The doctor bowed slightly. "I cannot apologize enough. We'll make sure this never happens again." But neither woman cared about apologies. At that moment, all they could feel was gratitude, raw and consuming. Tu Tien looked at Jack, her voice trembling. "You scared me to death," she whispered softly, brushing his hair from his forehead. "Don't you ever do that again." The monitor kept beeping, steady, faithful, alive. Tu Tien sat quietly beside Jack's bed, still holding his hand long after the chaos had passed. The morning sunlight spilled across his face, soft and warm, as if heaven itself had returned him to her. For 2 endless hours, she hadn't moved, her body trembling, her mind still haunted by the echo of the doctor's words. He didn't make it. Now, every breath Jack took felt like a miracle. Mrs. Loy sat near the window, her hands clasped tightly together, still whispering prayers of thanks. Her tear-streaked face showed exhaustion, but also relief, an unshakable kind of love only a mother could carry. When the nurse returned to check Jack's vitals, Tu Tien finally found her voice. "He's really safe now, isn't he?" The nurse smiled softly. "His pulse is steady, his fever's gone down, he's fighting, and I believe he'll win." Tu Tien nodded weakly. "I thought I'd lost him. For a few minutes, I couldn't breathe." The nurse gave her a sympathetic look. "That kind of mistake, it shouldn't happen, but you must rest, both of you. He'll need you when he wakes up." As the nurse left, silence settled again. Only the rhythmic beep, beep of the monitor filled the air. Mrs. Loy wiped her eyes. "You see, child? God heard us. Maybe this was to remind us how precious each breath really is." Tu Tien turned to her, eyes red. "When they told me he was gone, I saw our whole life vanish. The house, the twins, everything we dreamed of. I felt like I was falling into a hole I'd never climb out of." The older woman nodded. "That's what love is. It makes life terrifyingly fragile." She smiled faintly, "But also worth every tear." Tu Tien squeezed Jack's hand again. "I thought about all the things I never said, how I always told him to rest more, eat better, work less, but I never said thank you, not properly." Her voice cracked. "He rebuilt our life after the storms. He carried everything on his shoulders. I took that strength for granted." Mrs. Loy placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Then when he wakes up, tell him everything." Tu Tien nodded, wiping her tears. She looked at Jack's face, pale but peaceful, his chest rising steadily. "I will." A few hours later, a knock came at the door. The same doctor from earlier stepped inside, his expression solemn but composed. "Mrs. Tu Tien, Mrs. Loy," he began. "I came to personally apologize again. The mix-up was due to a patient in the next ward, also named Jack, same age group, admitted under similar circumstances. When the emergency happened, the report went to the wrong chart." Tu Tien exhaled shakily. "So, there was a Jack who didn't make it." The doctor nodded sadly. "Yes, the other Jack passed away early this morning. His family is devastated." For a moment, silence filled the room. The joy of Jack's survival tangled with the sorrow of another family's loss. Tu Tien looked down at her hands. "Someone else's Jack is gone because of fate, and mine was given back." The doctor bowed slightly. "Sometimes fate gives and takes in ways we don't understand. Please just take care of him now. He's stable, but very weak. When he left, Tu Tien sat still, staring at the floor. Mrs. Ly noticed her expression. "What's on your mind, child?" Tu Tien hesitated. "That other Jack, his wife, she must be feeling what I felt this morning. The world just stops. I can't stop thinking about her." Mrs. Ly nodded slowly. "Maybe you should see her." Tu Tien looked up, startled. "Now?" "Yes," the older woman said gently. "Sometimes sharing pain is how you find peace." Later that afternoon, guided by the nurse, Tu Tien walked down the hall to another ward. The air was heavy, quieter than before. At the far end, a woman sat by a bed covered with a white sheet. Her face was blank, too tired for tears. Tu Tien stopped a few steps away, unsure what to say. The woman turned slightly, her eyes empty yet kind. "You're the one they told by mistake, aren't you?" Tu Tien nodded, her throat tightening. "Yes, I'm so sorry for what you're going through." The woman gave a faint, trembling smile. "You don't need to apologize. When they said my husband was gone, I thought they were wrong. I prayed it was a mistake. And for a moment, I even hoped that maybe it was yours, that he was still alive somewhere." Tu Tien's eyes filled with tears. "I thought I lost mine too. For 10 minutes, I lived in your nightmare." The woman looked at her, her expression softening. "Then you know what it feels like, to lose the whole world in one sentence." Tu Tien nodded silently. "I do." For a moment, neither spoke. The air felt sacred, two strangers bound by the cruel hand of fate. Then the woman reached out, placing a hand over Tu Tien's. "Be grateful for every second you have left with him. Promise me that." Tu Tien gripped her hand tightly, tears falling freely. "I promise." When she returned to Jack's room, the light had dimmed to gold. The world outside the window was drenched in sunset. Mrs. Ly looked up as Tu Tien entered, reading the weight in her eyes but saying nothing. Tu Tien sat beside Jack again, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "You know," she whispered softly, "someone else didn't get this second chance, so you have to make it count." She smiled through tears. "You still owe me a promise. Our happy home isn't finished yet, and the twins are waiting to meet their father." The monitor continued its steady rhythm. A small movement flickered. Jack's fingers twitched. Tu Tien froze, holding her breath. Then his hand weakly tightened around hers. Her heart leapt. "Jack?" she whispered. "Jack, it's me." His eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. His voice was faint, rasping, but unmistakably his. "Did I sleep too long?" Tu Tien let out a laugh mixed with sobs. "You scared us half to death." He smiled weakly, eyes glassy but alive. "Sorry, I promised I'd come back." Tears streamed down her cheeks as she pressed his hand to her heart. "Then keep that promise, Jack. No more almosts." Mrs. Ly came closer, her voice trembling. "Welcome back, my son. You've been to the edge and back." Jack's eyes met hers, soft and full of emotion. "Guess I wasn't ready to leave home just yet." They all laughed quietly, the kind of laughter born from pain turned into relief. Outside, the sun dipped behind the hospital wing, and the city lights began to glow. The worst had passed. For Tu Tien, every breath Jack took now was a gift. Every moment felt fragile, sacred. She had looked into the face of loss and had been given love back instead. As she sat beside him, the beeping monitor echoed like a heartbeat of hope. In her heart, one truth took root. Sometimes fate takes you to the edge, not to break you, but to remind you how precious love truly is.